We spend our lives building foundations, thinking the walls we raise will eventually protect us in our weakness. I am Martha Vance, and for 68 years I believed that love was a ledger, that if I poured enough care, enough sacrifice, and enough silence into my family, the balance would always be in my favor. I was wrong. I stood in my own driveway, watching my son change the digital lock code on the front door, realizing that to them, I was no longer a mother. I was a depreciating asset. If you have ever felt invisible in your own home, or if you've wondered how a child you raised could turn into a stranger, I invite you to walk this path with me. Please subscribe and join our community. Like this video to help others find this story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support allows these quiet truths to finally be heard. The transition from home to guest happens so slowly you barely notice the temperature dropping. It started 3 months ago, not with a fight, but with a suggestion. Julian had come into the kitchen while I was making his favorite pot roast, the recipe with the rosemary from the garden. He didn't sit down. He hovered by the island, tapping his fingers on the granite I had picked out back in 2012. "Mom," he had said, his voice practiced and smooth, the way he spoke to his clients at the architecture firm. "Claire and I have been looking at the utility draws and the property taxes. This house it's a lot of square footage for one person to maintain. And with Sophie getting older, she needs her own wing, really, for her studies." I remember the way the steam from the pot felt on my face, damp and heavy. I didn't tell him that I maintained the house just fine. I didn't remind him that I was the one who weeded the flower beds, fixed the leaky faucet in the powder room, and kept the gutters clear while he and Claire went on decompressing trips to the coast. I just stirred the carrots and asked, "What are you saying, Julian?" "I'm saying we should simplify things," he replied. "There's a lovely assisted living community. No, let's call it a boutique senior suite over in West Lynn. It's closer to your doctor's. We've already looked at a floor plan for you." That was the first time I felt the ghost of the deed. When I bought this house after his father died, I wanted it to be the family anchor. I wanted Julian to have security. When he asked to be put on the title, claiming it would make the inheritance seamless and help him with his own credit for his firm's expansion, I didn't hesitate. A mother doesn't hedge bets against her own blood. I signed the papers in a wood-paneled office, feeling a sense of pride that I could give him that leg up. But standing in the hallway today, watching Claire peel my emergency contact list off the side of the refrigerator, that pride felt like a noose. "Do you have everything, Martha?" Claire asked. She didn't look at me. She was busy wiping the spot where the paper had been with a microfiber cloth. She treated my presence like a smudge on a window. "I have my clothes," I said softly, "and my books. I left the china. It was your grandmother's, Julian. I thought maybe you'd want Sophie to have it." Julian emerged from the basement, dusting off his hands. He looked tired, but it wasn't the tiredness of grief. It was the exhaustion of a man finishing a tedious chore. "Yeah, thanks, Mom. We'll store it. You won't have room for a hutch like that in the new place anyway." The new place was a one-bedroom apartment they had rented for me. They called it temporary, but the lease was for 2 years. They had picked it out without taking me to see it. Julian had described it as efficient and modern, words that usually meant small and cold. I walked to the entryway, my sensible shoes clicking on the hardwood. This floor had seen Julian's first steps. It had felt the weight of his father's casket. It had absorbed 30 years of my life. I reached out to touch the banister, the wood smooth and familiar under my palm, but I pulled my hand back. It didn't belong to me anymore. Legally, I was a tenant whose lease had expired. "The movers will be here for the heavy stuff on Friday," Julian said, checking his watch. He had a meeting at 2. He was always having meetings. "I'll drop the keys to your new place in your purse. I've already moved your car over there. I'll Uber you to the apartment now." "I can walk to the bus stop, Julian," I said. My voice was steady, a habit from years of library work. "It's a nice day." "Don't be dramatic, Mom," he snapped, though his tone remained low. "The neighbors don't need to see you trekking to the bus with a suitcase. It looks bad." It looks bad. That was the core of it. It wasn't about my comfort or my golden years. It was about the optics of his success. An architect of his stature couldn't have a mother rattling around in the big house if he wanted to repurpose it into a showpiece. As I stood on the porch, waiting for the black car he had summoned, I saw Sophie looking down from her upstairs window. My granddaughter. I had baked her birthday cakes for 14 years. I had stayed up with her when she had the flu so Julian and Claire could attend their gallery openings. She didn't wave. She just pulled the curtain shut. The rejection from the child was sharper than the rejection from the man. Julian handed me my coat. He didn't hug me. He gave me a brief, firm squeeze on the shoulder, the kind you give a colleague who's been laid off. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll see. Less stress for everyone." As the Uber pulled away, I looked back at the house. I saw Julian already on his phone, pacing the porch, gesturing at the roofline. He looked like he was already renovating. But my mind kept drifting back to that folder on the console table. It had the logo of a firm that specialized in distressed asset liquidation. I opened my purse to find my phone, and my fingers brushed against a small, cold object. It was a key Julian had forgotten to ask for. The key to the floor safe in the basement, hidden under the old workbench. The safe he thought was empty because I had moved the important papers to a bank box years ago. But I hadn't moved everything. I sat back in the car, the suburban trees blurring past. My heart wasn't racing. It was slowing down, turning into something cold and rhythmic. They thought they had evicted a tired old woman. They didn't realize they had just released the only person who was holding their fragile, debt-ridden world together. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that smelled like industrial citrus and unwashed laundry. Julian had called it contemporary, but to me, it felt like a waiting room for the end of a life. The walls were a shade of gray that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My furniture, the few pieces they deemed appropriate for the space, looked crowded and ashamed, like elegant guests trapped in a cramped elevator. I spent the first night sitting in the wingback chair that used to sit by the fireplace in the big house. Here, it faced a sliding glass door that looked out onto a parking lot and a dumpster. I didn't turn on the lights. I just watched the red and white sweeps of car headlights against the ceiling, rhythmic and cold. The next morning, the settling in began. It wasn't the physical act of unpacking that hurt. It was what Julian and Claire had chosen to pack for me. I opened a box labeled Kitchen 2 and found my everyday mugs, but not the hand-painted ones Sophie had made me in the 3rd grade. I found the mismatched Tupperware, but not the heavy cast-iron skillet I had used to cook Sunday breakfasts for 20 years. They had kept the quality, the heritage, and sent me the plastic. Around 10 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Julian. I stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings before answering. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How's the first morning in the new sanctuary?" He used words like sanctuary, the way a realtor uses cozy to describe a closet. It was a verbal coat of paint intended to hide the rot underneath. "It's quiet, Julian," I said. I was standing by the small galley kitchen, looking at a drawer that wouldn't close all the way. "I'm still finding where everything goes." Great. Listen, Claire is trying to find the guest linens, the ones for the primary suite. She's got a photographer coming over tomorrow for some before shots of the renovation, and she wants the bed styled a certain way. You wouldn't believe the chaos here, Mom. It's a madhouse without your organizational system. There it was. He hadn't called to ask if I had slept, or if I had enough milk, or if the transition was breaking my heart. He called because the unpaid labor I had provided for decades was suddenly missed. I was the ghost who kept the gears greased, and now the machine was grinding. "The linens are in the cedar chest in the attic hallway, Julian," I said, my voice as level as a librarian's whisper. "Top shelf, left side. They're wrapped in blue tissue to keep the dust off." "Perfect. You're a lifesaver. Oh, and did you take the remote for the garage door? We can't find the spare." "I left it on the hook by the mudroom door, Julian. Right where it's been for 12 years. Right. Must have gotten buried under the packing paper. Anyway, Claire says hi. We'll try to get over there this weekend with some groceries. Love you, Mom." He hung up before I could say "love you" back. I'm not sure I could have said it anyway. The words felt like they were stuck in a throat tight with the realization that I was now a tech support line for a life I no longer inhabited. I spent the afternoon walking the 3 blocks to the local grocery store. I bought a single chicken breast, 1 lemon, and a small bag of spinach. At the house, I used to buy in bulk, gallons of milk, 5-pound bags of flour, stacks of juice boxes for Sophie. Shopping for one felt like a rehearsal for being forgotten. When I returned to the apartment, I saw a woman about my age standing by the mailboxes. She wore a bright silk scarf and looked at me with a mixture of pity and recognition. "New on the 3rd floor?" she asked. "Yes, I moved in yesterday." "I'm Evelyn, 4B. If you're looking for the trash chute, it's behind the heavy door by the elevator. And don't bother calling the super about the water pressure in the mornings. It's a lost cause." She paused, her eyes scanning my face. "It's a hard shift, isn't it? From a house to a box?" "My son thought it would be simpler," I replied, the word simpler feeling like a lie in my mouth. "They always do," Evelyn said with a sharp, dry laugh. "They simplify us right out of their sightlines." She walked away, the click of her heels echoing in the hallway. I went into my apartment and locked the door. The silence was absolute. I sat at the small dinette table, a folding thing Julian had bought at a big box store because my oak table was too aggressive for the floor plan. I reached into my purse and pulled out the key I had kept, the key to the floor safe. I began to think about the folder I had seen on the console table, distressed asset liquidation. Julian was an architect. He was supposed to be successful. He drove a European SUV and sent Sophie to a private academy. But as I sat in that gray room, I started to remember small things I had overlooked in my role as the silent matriarch. I remembered the way he stayed in his car for 20 minutes before coming inside for dinner last month, his head in his hands. I remembered the past due notice I had accidentally seen in the mail stack 2 months ago, a notice for his firm's commercial lease. I had mentioned it, and he had snapped at me, telling me I was misreading the paperwork and that I should stay out of the business side of things. He hadn't moved me out for my golden years. He had moved me out because he needed the equity in the house. He was going to sell it, or mortgage it to the hilt, to save a sinking ship he was too proud to admit was taking on water. I looked at the key on the table. In that safe, beneath the old workbench in the basement he was about to gut, was something Julian didn't know existed. He thought I was a simple woman who had handed over her only asset out of maternal love. He didn't realize that his father, a man of many secrets and even more anxieties, had left a contingency that only I knew how to access. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Julian. I called my old friend Sarah, whose husband had been the town's most discreet accountant for 40 years. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I need to ask a favor. I need to know exactly how much debt a firm like Julian's can carry before the bank steps in. And I need to know it without Julian ever finding out I asked. As I spoke, I looked at the boxes in my living room. They were stacked high, a wall of cardboard between me and the rest of the world. For the first time in months, the exhaustion felt less like a weight and more like a shell I was beginning to crack. I was 68 years old. I had been simplified. But a simplified life is very easy to pack up and move when the time comes to leave for good. The question wasn't what Julian was going to do to the house. The question was what he was going to do when he realized the misc boxes he sent me away with contained the only thing that could have actually saved him. Claire arrived on Thursday afternoon, without calling first. She appeared at my door holding 2 grocery bags from a discount warehouse club and a stack of mail that had still been delivered to the house. She looked around my tiny living room with a forced, tight-lipped smile, the kind people wear when they're visiting a relative in the hospital and trying not to look at the machines. "It's actually starting to look quite efficient in here, Martha," she said, setting the bags on my small counter. "Julian was worried you wouldn't have enough room for your knickknacks, but you've really streamlined." I looked at the knickknacks she mentioned. They were hand-carved birds my husband, Arthur, had made during his final years. I had only brought 3 of them. The rest were in a box in Julian's garage, likely gathering cobwebs next to the lawnmower. "I brought some essentials," Claire continued, unpacking the bags. "Bulk-size oatmeal, some canned soups, and a large pack of industrial paper towels. We figured you wouldn't want to be running to the store every 5 minutes in this neighborhood." She said this neighborhood with a subtle twitch of her nose. The apartment was located in a part of town where the people were older, and the storefronts were slightly faded, a far cry from the manicured cul-de-sac where my house stood. She wasn't providing essentials. She was provisioning a bunker, so she wouldn't have to check on me as often. "Thank you, Claire," I said, my voice steady. "How is the house? Julian mentioned a photographer?" Claire's eyes lit up with a predatory brightness. "Oh, the before shots are stunning. We're tearing out the wall between the kitchen and the dining room next week. Open concept. It's going to be transformative. Julian thinks the property value will jump 20% just by removing that dated wallpaper you liked." That dated wallpaper. It was a soft cream damask that Arthur and I had chosen together. It had been the backdrop for every Christmas dinner and birthday party Julian had ever had. To Claire, it was just a barrier to a higher appraisal. "I forgot my gardening gloves," I said quietly, a lie I'd rehearsed. "The ones with the reinforced palms? I think I left them in the basement near Arthur's old workbench." Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over a can of tomato soup. "The basement? Martha, it's a mess down there right now. Julian's already had the contractors in to pull up the old carpet. It's all plastic sheeting and dust." "They're just gloves, Claire. I'd like to have them. I thought I might try to start a window box here." "I'll have Julian look for them," she said, her tone shifting to that of a busy mother dismissing a child's request. "He's so swamped with the firm right now, you wouldn't believe the stress he's under. Architecture is a brutal game these days. Everyone wants everything for nothing." She left shortly after, her designer heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She just left the bulk oatmeal as a peace offering for her conscience and vanished back to the life I had funded. An hour later, I met Sarah at a small, dimly lit diner 3 miles away. Sarah's husband, Ted, had been our family accountant for 30 years before retiring. He was waiting in a corner booth, a manila envelope resting on the formica table like a dormant landmine. "Martha," Ted said, his voice thick with a sympathy that made my stomach turn. "I did some digging. I still have a few contacts at the firm that handles Julian's professional audits." "Tell me, Ted. I need the unvarnished version." Ted sighed, sliding the envelope toward me. "The firm is a shell, Martha. He's been over-leveraged for 3 years. He took out a massive bridge loan to move into those fancy offices downtown, and he hasn't landed a major contract in 18 months. He's been shuffling money from one account to another just to keep the lights on." I felt a coldness settle in my chest. Not the coldness of shock, but of confirmation. "And the house?" "He took out a second mortgage the month after you put his name on the deed," Ted said softly. "He told the bank it was for structural improvements, but the money went straight into his firm's payroll. He's currently 3 months behind on that mortgage, Martha. The distressed asset firm Claire is talking to, they aren't just consultants. They're liquidators. He's trying to do a quick flip renovation to sell the house, pay off the debt, and hopefully walk away with enough to start over. But if the market dips even a fraction, he'll lose everything," I finished for him, "including the place he told me would be my home until I died." "I'm sorry, Martha. He's been very clever about hiding it. He's been using your good credit and the house's equity as his personal piggy bank." I thanked Ted and walked back to my apartment in the gathering dusk. I didn't feel like crying. I felt a strange, clinical detachment. I thought about Julian as a little boy, how he used to cry if he lost a single Lego piece. He had never learned how to lose, so he had learned how to steal instead. When I got back to the apartment, I didn't turn on the television. I sat at the table and opened the manila envelope. Inside were the public records of Julian's failures, the liens, the defaults, the desperate reaches for capital. He had treated my life's work as a disposable resource. But there was one thing Ted didn't know, and Julian certainly didn't know it. Arthur had been a cautious man. He had worked in industrial insurance, and he had seen 1,000 sure things go up in flames. Before he died, he told me something I had never shared with anyone, not even Julian. "Martha," he had said, his voice raspy in the hospital bed, "the house is the heart, but the basement is the bone. If the world ever turns upside down, look under the workbench. Not in the safe. Everyone looks in a safe. Look under the floorboard beneath the safe." I had checked it once, years ago. I had found a heavy oilcloth bag. I hadn't opened it then, out of a sense of loyalty to the life we were still living. I had assumed it was just a few $1,000s in emergency cash, Arthur's just-in-case fund. But now, I realized Julian's renovation was moving fast. If the contractors ripped up that floor to modernize the basement, whatever Arthur had hidden would belong to the construction crew or to Julian. I looked at the key in my purse. Julian thought he had evicted me. He thought he had simplified my life down to a 1-bedroom apartment and a pack of industrial paper towels. He didn't realize that by pushing me out, he had severed the only thing that kept me from protecting myself at his expense. I waited until 11 p.m. I knew Julian and Claire would be asleep, or perhaps Claire would be up late drinking wine and scrolling through Pinterest for open concept ideas. I put on my dark coat and took the bus back to my neighborhood. I didn't go to the front door. I used the old side gate that always squeaked, but I knew exactly where to lift it so it stayed silent. The house loomed over me, dark and unfamiliar with the new "For Sale" sign glowing faintly under the street lamp. I let myself into the basement through the bulkhead door, the one Julian never remembered to lock because he thought the neighborhood was too exclusive for crime. The basement smelled of sawdust and damp earth. The carpet had already been ripped up, leaving the concrete cold and naked. I made my way to the corner where the old workbench stood. It was covered in a heavy plastic tarp. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp anger. This was my home. I had paid for every brick, every nail, and every memory. I knelt on the cold concrete and reached under the workbench. My fingers found the edge of the floor safe, but I didn't put the key in. Instead, I felt for the seam in the concrete Arthur had mentioned, the one disguised by a deliberate crack in the foundation. I pulled back the loose section of flooring, my breath hitching in my throat. There was the bag. But as I pulled it out, I realized it wasn't just cash. There was a ledger and a series of stock certificates in a company that had been bought out by a tech giant 5 years ago. Certificates Arthur had bought in my name decades ago and never touched. I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. A light flickered on in the kitchen directly above my head. I froze, the oilcloth bag pressed to my chest. "Julian?" I heard Claire's voice, sharp and annoyed. "Did you hear something in the basement?" I stayed perfectly still in the dark, a ghost in the house I had built, holding the secret that could either save my son or finish him. I pressed my back against the cold masonry of the foundation, the oilcloth bag feeling like a lead weight in my arms. Upstairs, Julian's footsteps were heavy, vibrating through the floor joists. He wasn't the light-footed boy who used to sneak down here for popsicles anymore. He was a man, heavy with the gravity of his own failures. "It's probably just the house settling, Claire," I heard him say. His voice was muffled, but the irritation was sharp. "The floorboards are expanding because the heat's been off all day. I'm trying to save on the utility bill until the contractors start." "I don't like it," Claire replied. "It's creepy. It feels like your mother is still hovering. I swear I can still smell her perfume in the hallway." "She's in the apartment, Claire. She's fine. Go back to sleep." I waited for the click of the kitchen light and the receding rhythm of their footsteps. My heart slowed, but the rhythm was different now. Colder, more calculated. I crept back out through the bulkhead, the night air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't feel like a thief. You cannot steal what you have already paid for with a lifetime of service. By the time I got back to the gray apartment, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. I sat at the small folding table and emptied the bag. It wasn't just money. There was about $15,000 in old, crisp $100 bills. Arthur's walking away fund. But the real weight lay in the stock certificates and the small, leather-bound ledger. Arthur had been buying shares in a local utility company and a fledgling tech firm since the late 80s. He had registered them in my name only, bypassing any joint accounts. The ledger was the most devastating part. It wasn't a list of assets. It was a diary of observations. Arthur had seen Julian's nature long before I was willing to admit it. One entry from 1998 read, "Julian asked for more for the down payment. He doesn't understand the value of the brick, only the shine of the polish. Martha wants to give it to him. I will hide the rest. He will eat her alive if I don't." I ran my thumb over the ink. Arthur had loved our son, but he hadn't trusted him. And he had spent the last years of his life building a fortress for me that Julian didn't have the keys to. The phone rang at 9 a.m. It was Sophie. My heart lifted for a brief second before I heard the rehearsed tone of her voice. "Hey, Grandma. Mom said I should call and see if you wanted to come to my soccer game on Saturday." "I'd love to, Sophie. I've missed seeing you." "Yeah, cool. It's at the regional park, but, Mom said she might not have room in the SUV because they're picking up some marble samples for the new kitchen right after, so you'd have to find your own way there. And we might not stay for the whole thing." The exclusion was subtle, like a paper cut you don't feel until you see the blood. I was being invited to the regional park, 3 towns away, with no offer of a ride, to watch a game they intended to leave early. I was a box to be checked on a list of familial obligations. "I understand, Sophie," I said. "I'll see if I can manage the bus route." "Okay, great. Gosh, I have to go. My tutor is here. Bye." She hung up. I looked at the 3 hand-carved birds on my counter. I thought about the $15,000 on the table and the certificates that were worth significantly more. I could buy a car. I could move to a better apartment. I could hire a lawyer to look into the estate planning Julian had performed. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I have always done. I waited. On Saturday, I took 2 buses and walked a mile to the soccer fields. The wind was biting and my knees ached by the time I reached the sidelines. I saw Julian and Claire sitting in their folding chairs, the expensive, ergonomic ones. They hadn't saved a spot for me. When they saw me, Claire's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Martha, you made it. We weren't sure you'd want to travel all this way on the bus." "I didn't mind," I said, standing behind them because there was nowhere else to sit. Julian didn't even turn around. He was staring at his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly. "Hey, Mom, glad you're here. Listen, after the game, we've got that appointment. We probably won't have time for lunch." "That's fine, Julian. I just wanted to see Sophie play." I stood there for 45 minutes. I watched Sophie run, a blur of youth and indifference. I watched Julian and Claire talk in low, urgent tones about interest rates and liquidity. They treated me like a piece of luggage they had temporarily set down on the grass. At halftime, Julian finally stood up to stretch. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "You look tired, Mom. Maybe this apartment thing is harder on you than we thought. Maybe we should look into that full care facility sooner. They have a shuttle. You wouldn't have to deal with the bus." He wasn't worried about my fatigue. He was worried that my presence, this aging, bus-riding reminder of his responsibility, was an eyesore on his curated life. He wanted me further away, in a place where the shuttle handled the optics of my existence. "I'm not tired, Julian," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. "I'm just observing." "Observing what?" he asked, his eyes darting back to his phone. "How much everything costs," I replied. He laughed, a short, hollow sound. "Tell me about it. Everything is through the roof. Speaking of which, did you find those gloves in the basement? I looked where you said, but I couldn't find anything." "No," I lied. "I must have been mistaken about where I put them." As I walked back to the bus stop alone, they had forgotten to offer me a ride to the station. I felt a strange shift in my perspective. The hurt was still there, a dull throb in my chest, but it was being replaced by a clinical curiosity. I was watching a house fire in slow motion. Julian was so focused on the smoke, the debt, the renovations, the appearances, that he couldn't see the foundation was already gone. He thought he had taken everything I had. He didn't realize that by removing me from the house, he had removed the only person who would have stayed to help him put out the flames. When I got home, there was a voicemail on my landline. It was a woman from the distressed asset firm Claire had mentioned. "Ms. Vance? This is Sarah from Miller & Associates. We're finalizing the valuation on the property for Julian Vance. We found some inconsistencies in the original deed transfer from 5 years ago. There's a signature missing on the secondary disclosure form. We need you to come in and sign it so we can proceed with the sale." Julian said it wouldn't be a problem. I sat in my gray room, the shadows of the parking lot trees dancing on the wall. Julian had been so arrogant, so sure of my compliance that he hadn't even checked if the paperwork was complete. He had sold the skin before he'd even caught the bear. I didn't call her back. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea in one of my mismatched mugs. He needs that signature to sell the house. He needs that sale to save his firm. And he has spent the last 3 months making sure I feel like I have no voice, no home, and no power. I wonder how much a signature is worth to a man who is drowning. Julian didn't wait for the weekend to visit again. He showed up on Tuesday evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the industrial silos in the distance. He didn't bring groceries this time. He brought a single, slightly wilted bouquet of carnations from a gas station and a leather portfolio that looked far too heavy for a casual social call. "Mom, you're looking well," he said, though he didn't actually meet my eyes. He paced the small perimeter of my living room, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the cheap linoleum. "I was talking to the folks at Miller and Associates. It seems there's some boring administrative stuff we missed when we did the deed transfer. Just a few boxes to check to make sure your interest is protected during the renovation." He laid the portfolio on the folding table, right next to the 3 hand-carved birds. He had a gold fountain pen already uncapped. It felt like a stage prop, a symbol of the professional, successful man he was pretending to be. "What kind of interest, Julian?" I asked. I remained seated in my wingback chair, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't reach for the pen. "Oh, liability stuff. Since the house is technically in transition, the insurance companies need a clean slate. It's just a waiver, really. It says you vacated the premises and waive any claim to the ongoing construction risks." "It's for your own good, Mom. If a contractor gets hurt, you don't want them coming after your Social Security, do you?" He was lying. I knew from the documents Ted had shown me that this wasn't about insurance. It was about the fact that when I signed the house over, the legal description of the granny flat over the garage, the space I'd used as a sewing room, had been listed as a separate dwelling unit. To sell the property as a single-family luxury estate, he needed me to legally dissolve that unit. He needed me to sign away the last piece of the property that was still legally tied to my residency. "I'll need to read it over, Julian," I said softly. "My eyes are a bit tired tonight. The light in here isn't quite as bright as it was at the house." The irritation flashed across his face, a quick, sharp shadow. "Mom, it's a standard form. I've got the notary coming by the firm tomorrow morning. It would really help me out if we could just get this handled. I'm trying to keep the project on schedule." "Is the schedule very tight?" "Everything is tight," he snapped, then immediately softened his voice, though it sounded like a strain. "I just want this over with so we can get you settled somewhere more permanent. You don't want to live here forever, do you? The elevator was making a terrible noise when I came up." The bribe. He was dangling the promise of an exit from this gray box as a reward for my compliance. He didn't realize that the terrible noise of the elevator was the sound of my reality now, a reality he had chosen for me. "I'll look at it tomorrow," I repeated. He left the portfolio on the table, his frustration palpable. He didn't stay for tea. He didn't ask if I'd seen the soccer game photos Claire had supposedly posted. He just left, the door closing with a click that felt like a gavel. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk. Not to the park or the grocery store, but back to the old neighborhood. I took the bus, sitting near the back, watching the world transition from the cracked sidewalks of my new life to the manicured hedges of my old one. I stood across the street from my house. It was unrecognizable. A large dumpster sat in the driveway, overflowing with pieces of my life. I saw a familiar flash of blue, the floral rug from the hallway, the one I'd vacuumed every Saturday for 15 years. It was folded over a pile of broken drywall, covered in gray dust. Two men in work vests were carrying out the kitchen cabinets. My cabinets. The ones Arthur had stained by hand. They were tossing them into the dumpster like scrap wood. Then I saw Claire. She was standing in the front yard with a woman in a sharp suit, likely the liquidator. Claire was gesturing toward the old oak tree in the front yard, the one Julian used to climb. "The tree has to go," I heard Claire say, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "It blocks the light for the new floor-to-ceiling windows, and the roots are probably a mess for the new driveway layout anyway. It's an eyesore." The eyesore had been planted the day Julian was born. I stayed in the shadows of a neighbor's birch tree, feeling like a spy in my own history. I watched as Claire laughed at something the other woman said, a bright, careless sound. They were discussing the demolition phase, as if they were clearing away weeds, not a life. As I turned to leave, a car pulled into the driveway. It was a silver Mercedes I didn't recognize. A man got out carrying a briefcase. He looked around the property with the clinical eye of a predator. He didn't see a home. He saw a distressed asset to be flipped. I made it back to the bus stop just as my legs began to tremble. On the ride back, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. "Hey, Martha. Julian mentioned you were feeling a bit tired. We're going to be super busy this weekend with the renovation launch party for the investors, so we won't be able to do dinner. I'll send Sophie over next week with some more oatmeal. Hope you're enjoying the peace and quiet." The peace and quiet was a polite term for isolation. They were having a party in my house, the house I had paid for, to celebrate the destruction of my home, and I was being provisioned with oatmeal like a horse in a stable. I got back to the apartment and sat at the table. I opened Julian's portfolio. I didn't look at the waiver he wanted me to sign. Instead, I looked at the 3 hand-carved birds. I picked up the gold fountain pen Julian had left behind. He was so sure of his power that he didn't even mind leaving his tools. I pulled a piece of plain notebook paper toward me. I didn't write a letter of protest. I didn't write an angry manifesto. I began to write a list. 1. The value of the 500 shares of TechCorp at current market close. 2. The liquidation value of the municipal bonds Arthur hid. 3. The cost of a top-tier private investigator. I realized then that Julian and Claire were playing a game of speed. They needed to erase me before the bank erased them. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of the structure they were trying to renovate. You can't change the roof if the person who owns the foundation is still standing in the yard. I looked at the portfolio again. Julian had highlighted the signature line with a small X. He thought my silence was a sign of my fading mind. He didn't realize it was the sound of me listening to the house fall down. And I was beginning to realize that I didn't want to save it anymore. I wanted to see what was left when the dust finally settled. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card Ted had given me. "Mr. Sterling?" I said when the private investigator answered. "My name is Martha Vance. I believe my son is committing mortgage fraud, and I'd like you to find the evidence before he sells my house to someone else." As I spoke, I watched a single crow land on the dumpster in my mind, picking at the blue floral rug. The exclusion was complete. I was no longer a mother, a grandmother, or a wife. I was a creditor, and I was coming to collect. Mr. Sterling was a man who looked like he had spent his entire life in the shadows of other people's secrets. We met in a small, windowless office above a dry cleaner's, 3 days after the soccer game. The air smelled of steam and chemical solvent. He didn't offer me coffee. He just spread a series of high-resolution photographs across his desk. "These were taken yesterday afternoon," Sterling said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Your son has 3 different contractors on site. None of them have pulled permits with the city. That's a major violation, especially since they're knocking out load-bearing walls." I looked at the photos. My home looked like it had been hit by a mortar shell. The beautiful oak banister was gone, replaced by a temporary pine railing. The sunlight-filled kitchen was a cavern of gray dust. But it was the third photo that made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the basement. The workbench, Arthur's workbench, had been smashed to pieces. The concrete floor where I had retrieved the oilcloth bag was now covered by a fresh, uneven layer of gray cement. "He's hiding something," Sterling continued, tapping a finger on the photo of the basement. "He had his men pour a new pad over that corner at 4 in the morning. People don't do masonry in the middle of the night unless they're trying to beat a clock or hide a void." "He's looking for what I already have," I whispered. "Julian must have found the loose floorboard after I left. He must have realized the safe was a decoy. He was tearing the house apart, not just for a renovation, but because he was hunting for the contingency Arthur had mentioned. He was desperate for the money he thought was still buried there." "There's more," Sterling said, sliding a document toward me. "The distressed asset firm, Miller and Associates? They aren't just liquidators. Your son has been using their private lending arm to bridge his payroll. The interest rate is predatory, 22%. He's essentially pawned the house to a loan shark in a suit. If he doesn't sell that property within 60 days, they take everything. And since your name is still technically on that dwelling unit disclosure, they can't clear the title. You are the only thing standing between him and a total wipeout." I thanked Mr. Sterling and paid him with 3 of the old $100 bills from Arthur's bag. As I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Julian wasn't just being selfish, he was being reckless. He was gambling with my life to save a ghost of a career. When I got back to the apartment, my phone was ringing. It was Sophie. "Grandma, are you there?" She sounded stressed, her breath coming in quick gasps. "I'm here, Sophie. What's wrong?" "I'm at the house. The construction site. Mom and Dad are in a huge fight. Something about a stop work order from the city? And Mom is crying because the marble for the kitchen arrived and it's the wrong color, and the supplier won't take it back because Dad hasn't paid the last invoice." "Where are you, honey?" "I'm in my old room, but there's no door. They took the doors off to paint them. It's so loud and dusty here, Grandma. I hate it. Can I come stay with you? Just for a few nights? I can't study here." For a moment, my heart ached. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to pull her into the safety of my gray little box and protect her from the chaos her parents had created. But then, I looked at the room around me. I looked at the single chicken breast in my fridge and the folding chair. "I don't have a bed for you, Sophie," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Your father said there wasn't room in the floor plan for a guest space." There was a long silence on the other end. "Oh, right. I forgot." "Maybe you should ask your mother to take you to a hotel for a night," I suggested, though I knew Claire would never spend the money now. "She's too busy screaming at the contractor. Never mind. I'll just go to the library." She hung up before I could tell her I loved her. The neglect was trickling down. Julian and Claire were so consumed by the preservation of their status that they were letting their own daughter drift in the wake of their disaster. And I, the woman who had always been the safety net, was now a stranger in a one-bedroom apartment with no room for a grieving child. That evening, I logged onto social media, something I rarely did. I looked up Claire's profile. She had posted a renovation update video an hour ago. In the video, she was wearing a hard hat with a designer logo, smiling radiantly in front of the gutted remains of my living room. "Almost there," the caption read, "turning this dated relic into a modern masterpiece. Hashtag luxury living, hashtag transformation, hashtag new beginning." She had cropped out the dumpster. She had cropped out the "Stop Work" orange sticker I knew was taped to the front window. She was selling a lie to the world, even as her daughter hid in a room without a door. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite chime of a guest. It was a frantic, heavy pounding. I opened it to find Julian. He looked terrible. His hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt was stained with sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't wait to be invited in. He pushed past me into the room. "Where is it, Mom?" he barked, turning to face me. "Where is what, Julian?" "Don't play with me. I know Dad had a black fund. I found the floorboard. I found the empty space. You were there, weren't you? The night the light went on. Claire thought it was a ghost, but it was you. You took it." I stood by the door, my hand still on the knob. I felt remarkably calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was here, in the sanctuary you provided for me." "You're lying. You've always been too quiet, too observant. You've been sitting here watching us struggle, holding on to money that could save my firm. Do you have any idea what's happening? I'm 10 days away from a default. If I don't get that title cleared and a cash infusion, we lose the house. We lose everything." "You already lost the house, Julian," I said softly. "The moment you stopped treating it as a home and started treating it as an ATM." He stepped toward me, his hands shaking. For a second, I thought he might grab me, but he stopped, his own momentum collapsing into a desperate, pathetic slump. He sank into my wing-back chair, the only comfortable thing in the room, and put his head in his hands. "Please, Mom," he sobbed. It was a sound I hadn't heard since he was 10 years old and had broken his arm. "I'm in over my head. I did it for Claire, for Sophie. I just wanted us to have the best. If you have anything at all, I need it. And I need you to sign that waiver. Tonight." He pulled the crumpled portfolio from his jacket. He didn't look like a successful architect anymore. He looked like a man begging for a stay of execution. I looked at him, my son, my only child. I thought about the $15,000 in the bag. I thought about the tech stocks worth nearly $500,000. I could save him. I could sign the paper, give him the money, and let him limp along for another few years. But then I thought about the blue rug in the dumpster. I thought about Sophie in a room without a door. And I thought about the fact that he hadn't asked me how I was doing once in the last 20 minutes. "I can't help you, Julian," I said. He looked up, his face contorting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You mean you won't?" "I mean," I said, opening the door wider, "that I have already been erased. You can't ask a ghost for a loan." He stood up, his eyes cold and hard. "Fine, if that's how you want to play it, but don't expect another dime for this place. Don't expect us to check in. If you want to be a ghost, then be one. You're dead to us, Martha." He slammed the door so hard the hand-carved birds on the counter rattled. I sat down in the silence he left behind. My hands were steady. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Sterling. "The orange sticker," I said. "The stop work order. How long before the bank sends an inspector to verify the structural integrity of the loan collateral?" "If an anonymous tip comes in about the load-bearing walls," Sterling replied, 48 hours. "Send it," I said. I hung up and walked to the window. I looked out at the dumpster in the parking lot. It was empty. The world was quiet. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for the house to fall down anymore. I was the one pulling the lever. The silence that followed Julian's departure was not empty. It was heavy, like the air before a summer storm. I sat in my wingback chair for a long time, watching the digital clock on the microwave blink. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. A power surge must have reset it. It was a fitting metaphor for my life. The clock had stopped, and the rhythm I had lived by for 40 years had been severed. Being dead to your only child should feel like a heart attack. It should be a sharp, agonizing grief. But as I sat there in the dim light of the apartment, I felt a strange, cold relief. For decades, I had been the emotional shock absorber for Julian's temper and Claire's social anxieties. I had been the one to smooth over the cracks, to offer the loans, to babysit the child, and to keep the secrets. If I was dead to them, it meant I was finally off duty. The next morning, I went to the small local library. It wasn't the one I had worked in for years, that was across town, too close to the house. But it had the same smell of old paper and quiet intent. I sat at a computer in the back corner and pulled up the county's property tax portal. I looked up the neighbors' houses. I wanted to see the context of Julian's luxury flip. What I found was a pattern. 3 houses on our cul-de-sac had sold in the last 6 months, all for 20% less than Julian's projected asking price. He was building a palace in a neighborhood that was trending toward comfortable, not elite. He was over-improving a property that the market was already rejecting. As I scrolled, my phone buzzed in my purse. I expected it to be another angry text from Julian, or perhaps a sharp barb from Claire. Instead, it was a notification from a family-sharing photo app we had all joined years ago to share pictures of Sophie. I opened it. A new album had been created. Celebration Dinner, the New Chapter. There were 6 photos. One was a close-up of a high-end steak, a glass of dark red wine positioned perfectly in the background. The next was a group shot at a trendy downtown bistro. Julian was laughing, his arm around Claire, who looked radiant in a new silk dress. Sophie was in the corner of the frame, staring at her lap, her face pale. They were celebrating the renovation launch I had heard about. They were celebrating the destruction of my home using the money they didn't have, and they had done it 12 hours after Julian had screamed in my face that I was dead to him. The caption read, "Finally moving forward with the people who truly matter. Out with the old, in with the gold. Hashtag family first. Hashtag focus. Hashtag dream home." Out with the old. I wasn't just a person to them anymore. I was a piece of dated furniture they had successfully hauled to the curb. I closed the app and deleted it from my phone. I didn't need to see the digital breadcrumbs of a family that only valued me as a ledger entry. I spent the afternoon with Ted, the accountant. We met at a park bench this time, away from the prying eyes of the diner. He looked older in the daylight, his eyes clouded with worry. "Martha, the bank inspector went in this morning," Ted whispered, leaning in close. "Sterling's tip worked. They didn't just look at the permits. They looked at the primary residence clause in Julian's bridge loan. Since you moved out and since he hasn't officially moved in, it's still a construction site. He's in violation of the owner occupancy requirement for that specific interest rate." "What does that mean for him, Ted?" "It means they're calling the note, Martha. They've given him 7 days to either move in full-time and prove it's his primary residence, or pay back the bridge loan in full. And we both know he doesn't have the cash." I looked at a group of toddlers playing on the grass. They were so loud, so full of demands, so certain that someone would catch them if they fell. Julian had never outgrown that certainty. "There's something else," Ted said, his voice dropping even lower. "The granny flat disclosure you refused to sign? That's the sticking point. The bank won't allow him to consolidate the loan into a single-family mortgage without that signature. He's stuck with 2 separate tax IDs on a property that's currently a hollowed-out shell. He's effectively trapped in a legal no-man's land. I thanked Ted and walked back to my apartment. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting, like the shadow of a bird. I wasn't the one who had lied to the bank. I wasn't the one who had started a massive renovation without permits. I was simply the woman who had stopped lying for him. When I reached the apartment building, I saw a familiar car parked near the entrance. It was a mid-sized sedan, older and slightly dusty. Sophie was sitting on the curb next to it, her backpack at her feet. I hurried over to her. "Sophie, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her teenage armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked smaller than she had at the soccer game. "Dad is losing it, Grandma," she said, her voice trembling. "The bank people came today and stayed for 3 hours. He was screaming at Mom, and Mom started throwing things. The expensive marble tiles? She smashed one on the floor. She said it was all his fault for handling his mother poorly." She looked at the gray building behind me. "I don't have anywhere else to go. The house it's not a house anymore. It's just a bunch of boards and dust. Can I just sit on your floor? I don't need a bed. I just need it to be quiet." My heart broke, then immediately hardened. This was the collateral damage. Julian and Claire were so busy fighting for the throne that they were letting the kingdom burn with their daughter inside. "Come upstairs, Sophie," I said. As we rode the creaking elevator, I realized that Julian's simplification of my life had left me with no room to be a grandmother. I had a single chair, a single bed, and a single set of cutlery. I let her into the apartment. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at the boxes and the gray walls. "It's so small," she whispered. "It's what your father chose for me," I replied. I went to the kitchen and started making a grilled cheese sandwich, the only thing I had the ingredients for. But it is quiet. We sat in silence for an hour while she ate. Then, her phone began to vibrate. It was a call from Julian. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't answer it if you don't want to, Sophie," I said. She let it go to voicemail. Then came the text. She read it and turned the screen toward me. "If you're with your grandmother, tell her she's won. The bank is freezing the accounts. We're coming over there. Tell her to have the papers ready. We're done playing." I looked at the message. "We're done playing." He still thought this was a game. He still thought that if he applied enough pressure, I would fold, sign the waiver, and hand over Arthur's money to save his pride. "Sophie," I said, my voice steady, "I want you to go into the bathroom and lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you." "Grandma, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to show your father what happens when you try to evict a ghost," I said. I sat down at my small table. I didn't have the portfolio. I didn't have the waiver, but I did have the ledger Arthur had left me. I opened it to the very last page, a page I hadn't looked at closely until this morning. There, tucked into a small pocket in the leather binding, was a second deed. It was a deed for the very land the house sat on, separate from the structure itself. Arthur had bought the lot through a land trust 40 years ago and had never folded it into the residential deed. Julian owned the house, the hollowed-out shell, but I owned the ground it stood on. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps in the hallway. Julian and Claire were here, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the noise they made. The door didn't just open. It hit the wall with a hollow thud that made the framed photo of Arthur on the sideboard tilt to the left. Julian walked in first, his face a frantic mask of sweat and entitlement. Claire followed, her heels sharp on the linoleum, her designer handbag clutched like a shield. They brought the smell of the construction site with them: sawdust, cold rain, and the metallic tang of desperation. "Where are the papers, Mom?" Julian didn't look at me. He began pacing the 10-foot span of my living room, his eyes darting to every surface as if the solution to his ruin were hidden under a stack of coasters. "The bank has frozen the business lines. They've given me 72 hours to rectify the title issue, or they're initiating a forced sale. I need that waiver signed. Now." I remained seated. I felt like a stone in the middle of a rushing river, unmoved by the noise, simply letting the current break against me. "You didn't ask about Sophie," I said. Claire let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Sophie is fine, Martha. She's at the library or a friend's. We have real problems right now. Julian's firm, our entire life, is on the line because you've decided to be difficult about a clerical error." "She's in the bathroom, Claire," I said quietly. "She came here because she had nowhere else to go. Because the luxury renovation you're so proud of has left her without a door to her bedroom and parents who only speak to each other in screams." The silence that followed was heavy. Claire's face flickered, a momentary lapse in her curated armor, before she hardened again. Julian stopped pacing. He looked at the closed bathroom door, then back at me. "She shouldn't be here," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "She needs to be focused on her midterms. Look, Mom, I'm sorry I snapped at you the other night. I'm under a lot of pressure. But we're family, and family doesn't let each other fail like this. If you sign this waiver, the bank releases the hold. I can finish the flip, pay off the bridge loan, and we can all move on. I'll even get you a better place, a 2-bedroom, somewhere with a view." The bribe was so transparent, it was almost insulting. He was still trying to buy my silence with the very money he was stealing from my future. "I'm not signing the waiver, Julian," I said. "Why?" he roared, the mask of the repentant son slipping instantly. "Just to spite me? To prove you still have some kind of power over me? You're sitting in this dump, acting like a martyr, while you watch me lose everything I've worked for." "I'm not a martyr," I said, reaching for the leather-bound ledger on the table. "And I'm not doing this for power. I'm doing this because you've forgotten the most important rule of architecture, Julian. You have to understand what you're building on." I opened the ledger and pulled out the yellowed document Arthur had hidden in the secret pocket. I slid it across the folding table toward him. "What is this?" Julian sneered, picking it up with 2 fingers as if it were a piece of trash. "It's a land trust deed," I said, "dated 1984. Your father bought the 3 acres our house sits on through a private trust before he even applied for the construction loan for the house itself. He never folded the land into the residential deed. He kept them separate, paying the land taxes through a different account for 40 years. Julian's eyes scanned the document. I watched his face transition from confusion to a slow, creeping horror. As an architect, he knew exactly what he was looking at. "The house, the structure you've gutted, the walls you've knocked down, belongs to you," I continued, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "But the dirt beneath it? That belongs to the Vance Family Trust. And since Arthur passed, I am the sole trustee. Legally, Julian, your house is an encroachment on my land. You can't sell the house without the land, and you can't sell the land without me." The color drained from Julian's face. He looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he was wearing was actually an empty backpack. "This can't be right," Claire whispered, leaning over his shoulder to look at the paper. "We've lived there for years. We've paid the property taxes." "You paid the taxes on the improvements, the structure," I corrected her. "I've been paying the land taxes from my personal savings since Arthur died. You never noticed the second bill, did you? You were too busy looking at marble samples to look at the tax IDs." Julian sank onto the edge of my small bed, the document trembling in his hand. "Mom, why would Dad do this? Why wouldn't he just give it all to us?" "Because he knew you," I said. "He knew that if you owned the whole thing, you'd treat it like a poker chip. He wanted me to have the final say. He wanted to make sure that no matter how many new chapters you started, you couldn't erase the foundation of this family without my permission." "So what now?" Claire snapped, her voice high and thin with panic. "You're just going to let the bank seize the house? If they foreclose, they'll come after us for the deficiency. We'll be bankrupt. Sophie won't be able to stay in her school. Is that what you want? To ruin your own granddaughter's life to prove a point?" She was good. She went straight for the emotional jugular. But I had spent 30 years being moved by that kind of guilt, and the well had finally run dry. "Sophie is already losing her life, Claire," I said. "She's hiding in a bathroom because she's afraid of her own parents. Bankruptcy might be the most honest thing that's ever happened to this family." Julian looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom, please, just sign the land over to me. I'll pay you back, every cent. I'll give you a percentage of the sale, whatever you want." I looked at him, my son, the boy I had tucked in, the man I had funded. I saw the greed, the desperation, and the total lack of remorse for the way he had treated me. He didn't want my forgiveness. He wanted my signature. "No," I said. "No?" Julian stood up, his voice cracking. "You're going to let it all burn? You'd rather see the house demolished than help me?" "I'd rather see the truth," I said. "The bank inspector called me this morning, Julian. They found the structural damage you tried to hide in the basement. They know about the unpermitted load-bearing wall removal. Even if I gave you the land, the house is currently a liability, not an asset. No one will buy it in this state." I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. "I have a proposal for you, Julian, but you're not going to like it." Before I could speak, the bathroom door creaked open. Sophie stood there, her face tear-stained, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked at her parents as if they were strangers. "I want to go with Grandma," she said. Julian looked at her, then at me, then at the gray walls of the apartment. He looked like a man who had lost his map in the middle of a forest. "Go where?" he asked. "She lives in a box, Sophie." "The box is better than the wreck," Sophie replied. I looked at Julian. "I will sign the land over to the bank to satisfy the debt. I will save you from bankruptcy. But in exchange, you will sign over the remaining equity in the hollowed-out shell to me. And you will walk away. You and Claire will move into a rental. You will start over, without my credit, without my house, and without my silence." "You want the house?" Claire gasped. "It's a disaster zone. It'll cost hundreds of thousands to fix." "I have the money," I said. "Your father's contingency was more than just a bag of cash, Julian. It was a life insurance policy and a stock portfolio you never knew existed. I'm going to rebuild that house. But it won't be a luxury masterpiece. It will be a home again. And Sophie will have a room with a door." Julian stared at me, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He had spent months trying to evict me, only to find out I was the one who held the keys to his survival. "You've had the money this whole time?" he whispered, his voice thick with betrayal. "You watched us struggle and you did nothing?" "I watched you steal from me," I replied. "And I did exactly what you taught me to do. I observed." The room was silent, save for the sound of the rain against the window. Julian looked at the waiver, then at the land deed. He was trapped. He could either take my deal and lose his pride, or refuse and lose everything. "I need an answer, Julian," I said. "The bank is waiting for my call." As he reached for the pen, a new thought occurred to me. A question I hadn't asked myself yet. If I went back to that house, if I rebuilt it, would I ever be able to see it as anything other than a monument to what I had lost? Or was I just building a bigger cage for a ghost? The gold fountain pen Julian had left on my table felt heavy as he picked it up. He didn't look like the architect who designed towering glass structures anymore. He looked like a man signing a confession. His hand shook slightly, the nib scratching against the paper with a sound that felt like bone on stone. Claire stood behind him, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the land deed as if she could set it on fire with her gaze. With a final, jagged flourish, Julian signed away his interest in the house. He pushed the paper toward me and leaned back, his chest heaving. "There," he spat. "You have your house back, Mom. A hollowed-out, unmarketable wreck with a stop work order and a basement full of illegal concrete. I hope you're happy in your ruins." "I'm not happy, Julian," I said, folding the paper and placing it back into the ledger. Happiness was the lie we all lived for the last 10 years. This is just the truth. "We'll be out of the guest house by the end of the week," Claire added, her voice dripping with a poisonous politeness. "Since we're now tenants in your kingdom, I assume you'll want us gone immediately. I've already booked a long-term stay at a suite downtown." "With what money, Claire?" I asked. "The bank has frozen the business lines. Your personal accounts are tied to the firm's credit. If you go to a hotel, the card will be declined before you finish checking in." The silence that followed was brittle. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, the reality of their situation, the sheer vertical drop of their social standing, seemed to hit her. They weren't just losing a house. They were losing the ability to pretend. "You can stay in the guest house for 30 days, I said. "But you will pay the utility bills, and you will not touch the main house. It is a construction site, and I am the owner of record now." Julian stood up, his eyes dark with a resentment that I knew would never truly heal. "Come on, Sophie, we're leaving." Sophie didn't move. She remained standing by my small kitchen counter, her hand resting on her backpack. "I told you, Dad, I'm staying with Grandma." "Don't be ridiculous," Julian snapped. "She has one bed. You're going to sleep on the floor of a gray apartment while your parents are elsewhere?" "I'd rather sleep on Grandma's floor than in the middle of your war," Sophie said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual teenage rebellion. It was the voice of someone who had simply run out of air. Julian looked at me, then at his daughter, and for a second I saw a flicker of the man he could have been. A man who cared more about his child's peace than his own pride. But the flicker died, smothered by the weight of his own humiliation. "Fine," he said. "Stay. See how quiet it is when she starts treating you like a piece of the furniture, too." He and Claire left without another word. The door didn't slam this time. It clicked shut with a finality that felt like a burial. Sophie sat down on the edge of my bed. She looked around the tiny room. Is it okay if I use the extra blanket from the closet? Of course, honey, I said. I'll make up the wingback chair for myself. You take the bed. No, Grandma, I can't. I've spent 40 years making sure everyone else had the best seat and the softest pillow, Sophie, I said, and for the first time, my voice carried a weight of iron. Tonight, we are going to be honest. I am tired. You are exhausted. We will share the space, and tomorrow, we go back to the house. Not as guests and not as victims. As the people who are going to fix what they broke. The next morning, the gray box felt even smaller. We took the bus back to the old neighborhood. Sophie was quiet, her head leaning against the window, watching the suburban sprawl turn into the familiar green of our street. When we arrived at the house, the orange "Stop Work" sticker was still taped to the front window, fluttering in the breeze like a warning flag. The dumpster was still there, but it was now topped with a layer of rainwater. I walked up the driveway, my heels crunching on the gravel. I didn't feel the warmth of home. I felt the clinical detachment of a restorer. I let myself in with the side key. Inside, the house was a cavern of ghosts. Without the furniture, without the rugs, every word Sophie and I spoke echoed off the bare studs. The kitchen was a skeleton of wires and pipes. Julian had torn out the heart of the home, thinking he could replace it with something more expensive. I walked down to the basement. The new concrete pad Julian had poured over the corner where Arthur's bag had been was still slightly damp. It was a crude, ugly patch. I stood over it, looking at the gray slab. Julian thought he was hiding his search for money, but he was really just entombing his own desperation. I heard a floorboard creak above me. Sophie was standing at the top of the stairs. Grandma? There's a man at the door. He says he's from the city. I went back upstairs. A man in a tan windbreaker with a clipboard was standing in the gutted entryway. He looked around with a mixture of pity and professional annoyance. Mrs. Vance? He asked. I'm Miller from the Building Inspection Department. I'm here to follow up on the structural integrity report. I'll be honest, the previous owner, your son, left this place in a dangerous state. That load-bearing wall removal in the kitchen? If we get a heavy snow this winter, the second floor is coming down into the breakfast nook. I know, I said. What do I need to do to make it right? You need a structural engineer, a master carpenter, and about $60,000 just to get back to safe, let alone finished, Miller said. He looked at me, his eyes softening. It's a lot for a woman on her own, ma'am. Most people would just sell the lot to a developer and let them bulldoze it. I'm not most people, I said. And I'm not on my own. I looked at Sophie, who was standing by the window, tracing a finger through the dust on the sill. I have the plans, I continued. My husband kept the original blueprints in the attic. We aren't going to build a luxury masterpiece, Mr. Miller. We're going to put the walls back where they belong. After the inspector left, I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, the only place to sit in the entire house. I looked at the skeletal remains of my life. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Martha, this is Sarah from Miller & Associates. Julian has informed us of the change in ownership. We are prepared to offer you a cash buyout for the property as is. It would save you the trouble of the repairs and give you a very comfortable retirement. Think about it. This house is a wound. Why keep bleeding? I looked at the text, then at the Stop Work sticker. They were still circling. They thought I was a tired old woman who just wanted a quiet life. They didn't realize that for 30 years, I had been the one holding the walls up with my own silence. I didn't reply to the text. Instead, I stood up and walked over to the kitchen wall, the one Julian had partially demolished. I saw a small piece of the old damask wallpaper peeking out from behind a piece of new, raw drywall. I reached out and peeled back the drywall. There, written in pencil on the original plaster, were the height marks we had made for Julian as he grew. Julian, age 5. Julian, age 7. He had tried to tear it all down, but he had been too lazy to finish the job. He had left the marks of his own growth hidden behind a facade of modernization. I realized then that the house wasn't a wound. It was a witness. And as I looked at the marks, I felt the final tether to my son snap. He didn't deserve this house. He didn't deserve the land. And he certainly didn't deserve the silence I had given him for so long. "Sophie," I called out. "Yeah, Grandma?" "Find the broom in the garage. We're going to start with the dust." As I stood in the center of the ruin, I felt a new kind of power. It wasn't the power of the deed or the power of the money. It was the power of someone who has nothing left to lose because she has already been discarded. The bank was satisfied. The debt was settled. But as I looked at the basement door, I realized there was one more secret Arthur had left me. A secret Julian hadn't found, even with his midnight concrete. Julian thought the bag of money was the contingency. He didn't realize that in a house built on secrets, the most valuable things are never kept under the floorboards. They're kept in plain sight, where only the person who does the cleaning can ever find them. Sweeping a house with no walls is an exercise in futility, yet Sophie and I spent 3 hours doing it. The dust Julian's contractors had left behind wasn't just plaster and wood. It felt like the pulverized remains of my history. Every shovelful I tossed into the heavy-duty trash bags contained a piece of a memory, a splinter from the crown molding Arthur had installed, a flake of paint from the nursery. Sophie worked in a rhythmic silence that reminded me painfully of Arthur. She didn't complain about the cold or the fact that we were eating lukewarm soup out of thermoses. She just pushed the broom, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandma?" she asked, pausing near the skeletal frame of the dining room. "Why did they do it? They had a good life. We had a good house. Why did they have to break it?" I leaned against the broom handle, my back aching with a dull, familiar heat. "Because some people think that a thing only has value if it's new, Sophie. Your father and Claire, they didn't see a home. They saw a stage. And they thought if they changed the set, they'd become better actors." "They look like ghosts now," she whispered. "In the guest house. I saw Mom through the window this morning. She was just sitting on one of your old sewing chairs, staring at a wall. She didn't even have her phone." The image should have moved me to pity, but instead I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. The guest house, a small 2-room cottage over the garage, had been my sanctuary for years before I was moved to the apartment. Now, it was their prison. The reversal was so precise, it felt like a cosmic punchline. "I'm going to go check on the utilities," I said. "You stay here and finish the hallway." I walked across the damp grass to the guest house. The silver Mercedes was parked crookedly in the driveway, a "Final Notice" sticker from the leasing company tucked under the wiper blade. I didn't knock. I still had the key. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive wine and unwashed laundry. Claire was indeed sitting on my old velvet sewing chair. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. But her hair was lank, and her eyes were hollow. Julian was at the small kitchenette table, a half-empty bottle of bourbon standing between him and a stack of legal documents. "The electricity bill for this unit is overdue," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "And the water usage has doubled. If you're going to stay here for the 30 days, you need to settle the accounts." Julian didn't look up. "With what, Martha? The bank has put a lien on the business. My credit cards are being flagged for unusual activity every time I buy a sandwich. You took the land. You took the house. You've effectively crippled me." "I didn't take anything, Julian," I said, walking to the sink and turning off the dripping faucet. "I stopped you from losing it to strangers. There's a difference." "A difference?" Claire hissed, finally turning her head. "We're living in a garage, Martha. Our friends think we're on vacation in the Hamptons. Sophie is sleeping on a construction site with you. You've humiliated us." "You humiliated yourselves the moment you decided a marble countertop was worth more than your mother's dignity," I replied. "And Sophie isn't sleeping on a construction site. She's sleeping in a home, something you've forgotten the definition of." Julian finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked older. Not the distinguished older of a successful architect, but the frayed, gray older of a man who has realized his foundations were made of sand. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he asked. "The great, silent matriarch finally gets her revenge. The long-suffering wife finally has the upper hand." "I'm not enjoying it, Julian. I'm just finishing it. I spent 30 years making sure you never had to feel the weight of a consequence. I thought I was being a good mother. I realize now I was just building a monster." I walked back toward the door, but Julian stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Give me the stock certificates, Mom, the ones Dad left. I can use them as collateral to get a private loan. I can finish the house, sell it, and we can all be whole again." "I'll give you $1 million. Just let me fix this." The desperation in his voice was pathetic. He was still looking for the shortcut, still looking for the contingency to bail him out of his own ego. "No," I said. "The money is for Sophie's trust and for the repairs to the main house. You won't see a dime of it. You're going to do what I did for 40 years, Julian. You're going to work. You're going to figure out how to live within your means, and you're going to realize that no one is coming to save you." I left them in the dim light of the garage apartment and walked back to the ruin of the main house. When I entered, Sophie was gone from the hallway. I found her in the attic. She was sitting on a pile of old blankets, looking at a small wooden crate I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked behind the chimney flue, covered in a thick layer of insulation dust. "I found this under the floorboards up here," Sophie said. "It has your name on it, Grandma." I knelt beside her, my heart tripping in my chest. I recognized the crate. It was the one Arthur used to keep his old surveying tools in. I pried the lid open. Inside weren't tools, and it wasn't money. It was a collection of envelopes, each one dated. I opened the top one. It was a letter from a law firm in the city, dated 10 years ago. I scanned the lines, my breath hitching. "Dear Mr. Vance, as per your instructions, the secondary insurance policy on the structural integrity of the residence at 42 Willow Lane has been maintained. In the event of unauthorized major structural modifications that jeopardize the primary residence, the policy provides a total replacement value, payable only to Martha Vance." Arthur hadn't just hidden money. He had anticipated Julian's recklessness. He had known, with a terrifying, loving foresight, that Julian would eventually try to tear the house apart. The policy was a failsafe, an insurance against our own son. But there was a catch. I read further down the page. The claim must be filed within 90 days of the commencement of unauthorized work. To verify the claim, the trustee must provide proof of the structural damage through a certified city inspector's report. I looked at the date on the stop work order in my pocket. Julian had started the demolition 75 days ago. I had 15 days. "What is it, Grandma?" Sophie asked. I looked at the skeletal walls, the missing windows, and the gray concrete patch in the basement. I looked at the little girl who had lost her world because her father wanted a masterpiece. "It's a map, Sophie," I said, my voice gaining a new, sharp edge. "It's the way we're going to put this house back together. But your father can't know. If he finds out about this policy, he'll try to claim the interest as a debtor in possession. We have to move quietly." I realized then why Arthur had kept the land and the house separate. He hadn't just been protecting me. He had been setting a trap for Julian's greed. The house had to be ruined for the policy to pay out. Julian had done exactly what the policy required. He had destroyed the house for me. I closed the crate and looked at my granddaughter. "Go back to the guest house and get your things. We're going back to the apartment for the night. We have a lot of phone calls to make." As we walked out of the house, I looked up at the guest house window. Julian was standing there, watching us, a silhouette of a man who thought he had lost everything. He didn't realize that his destruction was the only thing that was going to fund my rebirth. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy. It was the feeling of a structure finally settling into its true shape. The silent matriarch was done observing. I was about to become the architect. The morning air in the gray apartment felt different, sharper, as if the urgency of the 15-day deadline had ionized the very oxygen. Sophie was already awake when I sat up in the wingback chair. She was sitting at the small folding table, the envelopes from the attic spread out before her like a deck of cards. She had organized them by date, her young mind already grasping the mechanical nature of the trap Arthur had set. "Grandma," she said, not looking up, "if the policy pays out to you and the bank already has the land title in the trust, does that mean Dad gets nothing, even if he stays in the guest house?" "It means," I said, my voice raspy from a night of shallow sleep, "that your father is legally a bystander in his own disaster. He signed over the structure to me to avoid the debt. He doesn't know this policy exists because he never bothered to look at the boring paperwork in the attic. He only looked for the gold in the basement." "He's going to be so angry," she whispered. "Anger is a luxury for people who still have options, Sophie. Right now, your father is just trying to survive the day. We are trying to survive the decade." I spent the next 2 hours on the phone. I didn't call Julian. I called Miller, the city inspector. I needed him back at the house, but I needed him to be thorough, clinical. I needed the structural integrity report to be a death certificate for Julian's vision. We arrived at the house at 11 a.m. The silver Mercedes was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of Julian or Claire. The guest house curtains were drawn tight, a signal of their self-imposed exile. Miller met me at the front door. He looked at the paperwork I held, the specific clauses from the insurance policy Arthur had maintained. He whistled low, his eyes scanning the technical language. "Your husband was a hell of a strategist, Mrs. Vance," Miller said. "Most policies exclude renovation gone wrong, but this..." This is a structural preservation rider. It specifically covers unauthorized demolition that compromises the primary load-bearing system. It's rare, it's expensive, And it's exactly what happened here. I need the report to be final, Mr. Miller. No potential for repair clauses. The policy triggers on total functional loss of the residential core. Miller looked at the kitchen ceiling, where the second floor was visibly sagging into the void Julian had created. You won't have to lie, ma'am. He didn't just remove a wall. He severed the spine of the house. I'll have the certified report to you by tomorrow morning. As Miller walked through the ruins with his laser levels and clipboards, I stood in the center of the living room. I could hear the ghosts of 30 years. I could hear the laughter from the 1995 Christmas party, the sound of Julian's graduation dinner, the quiet murmurs of Arthur and me as we grew old together. Julian hadn't just removed the walls. He had let the cold in. Suddenly, the side door of the guest house slammed open. Julian marched across the grass, his face flushed. He was wearing a suit jacket over a t-shirt, a pathetic attempt to maintain his professional identity. "What is he doing here, Mom?" Julian demanded, gesturing at Miller. "I told you, I'm the one who knows this structure. If you're having more inspections done, I should be the lead. I can talk him through the remediation plan." "There is no remediation plan, Julian," I said. I stood my ground, my feet planted on the plywood subfloor. "There is only an assessment of the damage you caused." "I was improving it," he shouted, his voice echoing off the bare studs. "I was bringing it into the 21st century. You're acting like I committed a crime. I'm an architect. My firm has won awards." "Your firm is a ghost, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than his scream. "And your improvements have made this house uninhabitable. Mr. Miller is here to certify that fact." Julian turned to Miller, his eyes wild. "Listen, buddy, I know the code. We can jack up that header. We can sister the joists. It's a 48-hour fix. Don't write anything that compromises the resale value." Miller didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect, you don't have a license in this city anymore. I checked the registry this morning. Your professional insurance carrier flagged your status 3 days ago. You're a civilian now. Please step back and let me do my job." The silence that followed was devastating. Julian's shoulders slumped. The award-winning architect vanished, leaving behind a middle-aged man with a stain on his shirt and no ground beneath his feet. He looked at me, and for a moment the rage was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow vacuum. "You're killing me, Mom," he whispered. "You're actually going to strip me of everything." "You stripped yourself, Julian. I'm just the one documenting the loss." He turned and walked away, not back to the guest house, but toward the street. He didn't take the Mercedes. He just started walking, his suit jacket flapping in the wind, a man with nowhere to go and no one to blame but the woman he had tried to erase. Claire emerged from the guest house a few minutes later. She didn't approach us. She stood on the small porch, her arms crossed, watching Sophie. "Sophie!" Claire called out. "Come here. I need help with the packing." Sophie looked at me. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of the old habit of obedience. "Go see what she wants, Sophie," I said softly. "But remember, you don't have to carry anything you didn't pack yourself." I watched my granddaughter walk across the lawn. She looked so much older than 14. She had been forced into the role of the silent observer, just as I had been. Miller finished his walkthrough an hour later. He handed me a preliminary summary. "It's a total loss, Mrs. Vance. The cost to restore the structural integrity exceeds 80% of the building's value. In the eyes of the city, this is a teardown." "Thank you, Mr. Miller." I waited until he drove away. Then I went down to the basement one last time. I stood over the gray concrete patch Julian had poured. I realized then that Julian had been looking for a different kind of treasure. He thought Arthur had hidden a black fund of cash. But I knew Arthur. He didn't believe in cash. He believed in leverage. I walked to the far wall where the old coal chute had been sealed off decades ago. There, behind a loose brick that only I knew about because I was the one who painted the basement every 5 years, was a small, rusted tin box. I opened it. Inside were the original site surveys and a set of photos Julian had never seen. They were photos of the foundation being poured in 1982, and there, in the corner of the frame, was a man Julian would recognize, the current head of the bank's lending department, shaking hands with Arthur. The man who had approved Julian's bridge loan was the same man who had helped Arthur set up the Vance Family Trust land structure. The bank hadn't discovered the missing signature on the deed by accident. They had been waiting for me to tell them when to look. I realized then that I wasn't the only silent one in this family. Arthur had been playing a game that lasted long after his heart stopped beating. He hadn't just protected me. He had orchestrated a slow-motion collapse that would only stop when I decided it was over. My phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "I'm at the bridge. I don't think I'm coming back tonight. Tell Claire I'm sorry I couldn't be the man she wanted." The melodrama of it should have panicked me. It was the ultimate move of an emotionally exhausted man, the threat of self-destruction to regain control. I looked at the skeletal walls of the house. I looked at the tin box in my hand. I typed back 4 words. "The house is cold, Julian." I didn't call the police. I didn't call Claire. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase and waited for the sun to go down. I knew Julian wouldn't jump. He loved himself too much to become a ghost. He was just waiting for me to beg him to stay. But I was done begging. I was done being the shock absorber. Tomorrow was day 14 of the 15-day window. The report would be filed. The claim would be made. And the silent matriarch would finally have enough money to buy the one thing Julian couldn't design. A future where he was no longer the center of the world. The final day of the 15-day window arrived with a cold, unrelenting rain that turned the construction site into a sea of red mud. I didn't wait for Julian to come home from his bridge. I spent the morning in a glass-walled office downtown, sitting across from the man in the foundation photos. Mr. Henderson, the senior vice president of the bank. He didn't look at me with the pity Claire used, or the frustration Julian did. He looked at me with the weary respect of a co-conspirator. He slid a final document across the desk. The insurance payout authorization and the deed reconveyance. "Your husband was a very specific man, Martha," Henderson said softly. "He told me 20 years ago that if Julian ever stopped asking for advice and started asking for equity, I should give him exactly enough rope to reach the end of his tether. I suppose we've reached it." "The bridge loan Julian took," I said, my voice steady as I signed the last page. "The one that ultimately froze his accounts. Who was the private investor that backed that high-interest line?" Henderson paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You know the answer, Martha. The Vance Family Trust provided the capital for the bank's bridge lending arm. Legally, Julian was borrowing his own inheritance at 22% interest. He was paying you to ruin himself." I walked out into the rain, the weight of the secret tucked safely into my purse. I hadn't just observed my son's collapse. I had funded the mirror he finally had to look into. Arthur had known that Julian wouldn't value a gift, but he might learn from a loss. I returned to the house one last time. Julian was there, sitting on a milk crate in the middle of the gutted living room. He looked small beneath the sagging ceiling. The silver Mercedes was gone, repossessed that morning. Claire was nowhere to be seen. Sophie had told me she'd gone to stay with her sister, leaving Julian to face the debris alone. "The claim is filed, Julian," I said, standing in the entryway. He looked up, his eyes empty. "So you get the money. You get the house. You get everything. Are you going to rebuild it? Are you going to put the dated wallpaper back up and pretend I never happened?" "No," I said. "I'm not rebuilding it." He blinked, confusion flickering in his hollow gaze. "Then why? Why go through all this if you don't even want the house?" "Because you needed to see what it looks like when you remove the people who hold up your world," I said. "I've sold the land to a local conservancy. They're going to tear this structure down and turn the 3 acres into a community garden. Sophie will have a scholarship from the sale, and I will have a small cottage by the coast." Julian stood up, his voice a ragged whisper. "A garden? You're turning my home, our history, into dirt?" "It was already dirt, Julian. You made sure of that when you invited the liquidators in. I'm just making sure something useful finally grows here." I turned to leave, but I stopped at the threshold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, hand-carved bird Sophie had liked, the one Arthur had made. I set it on the raw floor joist next to Julian. "Your father's contingency wasn't for me, Julian," I said. "It was for you. He knew you'd never be a builder until you learned what it felt like to be a ghost. I hope you find your way back to the living someday, but you'll have to do it on your own feet." As I walked down the driveway, Sophie was waiting for me in my old, reliable sedan. She didn't look back at the house. She looked at me, and for the first time in months, her eyes were clear. "Where to, Grandma?" she asked. "Forward, Sophie," I said. "Just forward." Behind us, the house stood as a hollowed-out monument to a man who thought he could outrun his foundations. The silent matriarch was gone. I had spent 40 years building walls for people who didn't deserve the shelter. Now, I was finally stepping out into the rain, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the cold. I looked in the rearview mirror as we turned the corner. I didn't see a tragedy. I saw a cleared sight, ready for a season of rest. Julian had wanted a modern masterpiece, but he had forgotten the most basic truth of the earth. Before anything beautiful can grow, the rot has to be cleared away. The house was finally quiet, and so was I.